Emma stood by the kitchen window, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Outside, the sun bathed the garden in golden light, but inside, the air felt heavy, stagnant. She glanced at the clock. 7:45 p.m. Mark would be home in 15 minutes like clockwork. He'd greet her with a nod, maybe a brief smile, and then retreat to his study. That had been their routine for months. She sighed and shifted her gaze to the reflection of her own tired face in the window. The sharp lines around her eyes betrayed sleepless nights and endless thoughts. It wasn't anger that weighed her down, nor was it sadness. It was the emptiness of indifference, the slow unraveling of a bond she once held sacred. "Mom, you okay?" The voice startled her. She turned to see Jason standing in the doorway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. His hair, slightly tousled, gave him a carefree appearance that contrasted with the concern in his eyes. At 19, he carried himself with a confidence that belied his age, yet there was something gentle about him, something grounding. "I'm fine," Emma said, forcing a smile. "Just lost in thought." Jason stepped into the room and leaned against the counter opposite her. "You've been doing that a lot lately," he said softly. "Is it, Dad?" Emma flinched at the question, though she'd expected it. Jason was perceptive, always had been. "It's not that simple," she replied, avoiding his gaze. Jason nodded, as if he understood more than she'd said. "You know you can talk to me, right? I'm here." The sincerity in his voice warmed her, even as it unsettled her. She wasn't used to leaning on Jason, but in recent weeks, he'd become her confidant in subtle ways. A shared look, a kind word, a small gesture. She hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Jason. That means a lot." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Emma withdrew her hand and turned back to the window, watching Mark step out of his car, briefcase in hand. Her heart sank, a familiar ache. Jason followed her gaze and frowned. "He should appreciate you more," he muttered. "Jason," Emma began, but he shook his head. "Don't worry about it, Mom." He straightened and stretched, his lean frame silhouetted against the kitchen light. "By the way, you mentioned your back was bothering you yesterday. Want me to help with that later?" Emma blinked, caught off guard by the offer. "You don't have to." "I don't mind," Jason interrupted with a grin. "I've got strong hands, remember?" He flexed his fingers playfully. She chuckled despite herself. "All right, but only if you're sure." Mark entered the house moments later, his presence barely registering in the room. He gave Emma a quick nod and murmured, "Evening," before disappearing upstairs. Emma's shoulders slumped. Jason's jaw tightened. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of Mark closing his study door. "Let's take care of that back," Jason said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "You deserve to relax." Emma hesitated, then nodded, grateful for the distraction. Later, as Emma lay on her stomach on the living room couch, Jason knelt beside her, his hands pressing gently into her lower back. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan. Emma closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the sensation. "You've got tension here," Jason murmured, his fingers expertly working out a knot. Emma exhaled slowly. "It's been a long few months." Jason didn't respond immediately, but his hands stilled for a moment before resuming their motion. "You should take care of yourself more, Mom," he said softly. "You always put everyone else first." A lump rose in her throat. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded. As the massage continued, a strange mix of emotions swirled within her: comfort, guilt, and a faint, inexplicable unease. She pushed the latter aside, focusing instead on the warmth of her son's hands and the rare sense of being cared for. When Jason finally stopped, Emma sat up slowly, pulling her cardigan tightly around her. "Thank you, Jason," she said, her voice quiet. "Anytime," he replied with a small smile. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Emma felt an undercurrent of something she couldn't name. She broke the gaze, standing quickly. "I should check on your father." Jason's smile faltered, but he nodded. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Jason." As Emma climbed the stairs, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had shifted something unspoken, something fragile yet profound. In the quiet of her bedroom, she resolved to ignore it, for now. But deep down, she knew that some fractures couldn't be mended by simply looking away. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Emma's bedroom, casting soft streaks across the unmade bed. She lay on her side, eyes fixed on the digital clock on the nightstand. It was 6:12 a.m., far too early to be awake, but her mind refused to quiet. The tension from the previous night lingered, subtle yet persistent, like a faint whisper she couldn't quite understand. Mark's side of the bed was empty, as it often was these days. She reached out and brushed her fingers over the cold, unused pillow. How had they drifted so far apart? Downstairs, the sound of movement pulled her from her thoughts. Jason, no doubt. He always woke early, even on weekends. She pushed herself out of bed, tugged on her robe, and padded quietly down the hall. When she reached the kitchen, she found him standing by the stove, flipping pancakes with a precision that made her smile. His back was to her. His tall frame relaxed as he hummed a tune under his breath. "Good morning," Emma said softly, leaning against the doorframe. Jason turned, his face brightening. "Morning, Mom. Pancakes." She nodded, stepping into the room and pouring herself a cup of coffee. The rich aroma filled the space, mingling with the warmth of the morning. "You didn't have to cook," she said, though she was grateful. Jason shrugged, sliding a pancake onto a plate. "Figured you could use a break." He set the plate in front of her with a grin. "Besides, it's the least I can do after last night." Emma paused, her hand tightening around the coffee mug. "About that," she began, searching for the right words. Jason raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting her gather her thoughts. "I appreciate what you did," she continued slowly, "but I think we need to set some boundaries." Her voice wavered, unsure of how he'd respond. Jason's expression shifted, the light-heartedness in his eyes replaced by something deeper. "Did I make you uncomfortable?" he asked quietly. Emma hesitated, caught off guard by his directness. "No, not exactly," she said quickly. "It's just, things have been complicated lately, and I don't want us to blur any lines." Jason nodded, his gaze steady. "Get it. I just wanted to help. You've been carrying too much on your own." Her chest tightened at his words, a wave of guilt washing over her. "You're thoughtful, Jason," she said softly. "And I'm lucky to have you. But some things need to stay between me and your father." Jason's jaw tensed at the mention of Mark, but he said nothing, instead turning back to the stove. "Understood," he said after a moment, his voice even. The silence between them was heavier than usual, weighted with things unsaid. Emma wanted to reach out to say more, but the words felt tangled in her throat. Mark's footsteps echoed down the stairs, breaking the moment. He entered the kitchen, his usual air of detachment firmly in place. "Morning," he said curtly, grabbing a cup of coffee without sparing a glance in their direction. Emma watched him, her heart sinking. Jason's eyes followed his father, a flicker of resentment passing across his face. "I made pancakes," Jason said, his tone flat. Mark nodded absent-mindedly. "Thanks, but I'm in a rush. I have a meeting in an hour." He took a sip of coffee, already turning toward the door. Emma's stomach twisted. "Mark, it's Saturday," she said, her voice firmer than she intended. "I know," he replied, his tone dismissive. "This can't wait." Jason's grip tightened on the spatula, but he kept his gaze on the stove. "Right. Work comes first," he muttered under his breath. Mark paused, his brow furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Jason said quickly, though his eyes betrayed his frustration. "Forget it." Mark glanced between them, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he left the kitchen, the sound of the front door closing echoing through the house. Emma let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her fork. I'm sorry you have to see this, she murmured, her appetite fading. It's not your fault, Jason said firmly, sitting across from her. You deserve better, Mom. You both do. His words hung in the air, a bittersweet truth that neither of them could deny. Emma managed a weak smile, but inside, she felt the weight of his disappointment, her own fears mirrored in his eyes. As they ate in silence, Emma knew this was far from over. Something had to change, and soon, before the cracks in their family grew too wide to mend. Her resolve hardened. Tonight she would confront Mark, even if it meant unraveling everything. She owed it to herself and to Jason to fight for something better. For now, though, she focused on the quiet moment with her son, the space between them filled with an unspoken understanding that, despite everything, they would face whatever came next together. The house was quiet that evening, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room. Emma sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. She had spent the entire day rehearsing what she would say to Mark, but now, as the moment drew near, her resolve wavered. The tension between them had become a constant shadow, looming larger with each passing day. Jason's footsteps sounded behind her, soft against the hardwood floor. He paused in the doorway, observing her with a quiet intensity that made her heart ache. "You're going to talk to him tonight, aren't you?" he asked, his voice steady but low. Emma nodded without looking at him. "It's long overdue." Jason crossed the room and sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Do you think he'll listen?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I have to try." The faint hum of Mark's car pulling into the driveway interrupted their conversation. Emma inhaled deeply, willing herself to stand as the sound of the front door opening and closing reached them. Mark entered the living room moments later. His tie loosened, his face a mask of weariness. "Mark," Emma said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We need to talk." Mark stopped, his brow furrowing. "Can it wait? It's been a long day." "No, it can't," Emma replied, standing her ground. Jason rose from the couch, his presence a quiet support. "I'll give you two some space," he said, casting a meaningful glance at his mother before retreating upstairs. Mark watched him leave, then turned back to Emma, his expression guarded. "What's this about?" Emma gestured for him to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, he complied, settling into the armchair across from her. "It's about us," she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mark, I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. We've drifted so far apart, and I don't even know how to reach you anymore." Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Emma, I know things haven't been perfect, but I've been doing my best to provide for this family. Work's been demanding." "This isn't about work," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "It's about us. You're always somewhere else, even when you're here. I feel like a stranger in my own marriage." Mark's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "I'm trying." "Are you?" Emma pressed, her frustration boiling over. "When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you even asked how I'm doing?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily between them. Mark's shoulders slumped, and for the first time in months, Emma saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. I thought I was doing what needed to be done." Emma's throat tightened, her anger softening. "Mark, I don't need perfection. I need connection. I need to feel like I matter to you." He looked at her, and for a moment, the walls he'd built around himself seemed to crumble. "You do matter, Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this." "You start by trying," she replied gently. "By being here, really here, and not just in the same room. We can't keep ignoring this and hoping it'll go away." Mark nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been so focused on everything else that I've lost sight of what's important." Emma reached across the coffee table and took his hand, her touch tentative. "We can fix this," she said softly. "But it's going to take both of us." He looked up, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I want to try," he said. His voice filled with quiet determination. A faint creak on the stairs made them both turn. Jason stood at the top, his expression unreadable as he observed the scene below. "Jason," Mark said, his voice faltering slightly. Jason descended the stairs slowly, his eyes flicking between his parents. "Are you two okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. Emma offered him a small smile. "We're working on it," she said. Jason nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. You should." The three of them stood in the living room, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Though the road ahead would not be easy, the first step had been taken. As the clock continued its steady rhythm, Emma felt a spark of hope flicker within her. For the first time in a long while, she believed they might find their way back to each other. But the shadows of their silence wouldn't dissipate overnight, and the true test of their resolve was still to come.